So next up, Stuart Kauffman, who actually is extremely difficult to describe since he's a complexity theorist, biologist, looked at economies at the Santa Fe Institute, is now at the University of Calgary, and has written some really wonderful books, which I do recommend if I could remember the titles. But
I can.
You probably can, but I will read them anyway. Origins of Order, At Home in the Universe, nice book called Investigations, by the way. And then he has a book coming out which really is the subject of this talk. Book's due in April 2008, and it's called Reinventing the Sacred, although it now has a subtitle as well, I think.
Well, I'm very worried about the subtitle.
Okay. In that case, we'll leave the subtitle. You got
I've got my own thing. Well, Roger, I'd like to thank you for inviting me. I wanted to come last year very much, but was not able to. Deirdre said many things, but I want to pick up on one thing that she said. She was talking about the fact that innovation is not routine, that it's, in fact, an invention, and it cannot be foreseen. This is going to be quite central to where I'm going to get. So just hold that in mind. I want to show you that the same thing is happening in the evolution of the biosphere. The biosphere evolves often in ways that we cannot prestate. And I think that that has radical implications for our understanding of science itself. Let me begin by placing this, if I may, in a broader societal global context. In 1993, Samuel Huntington, then at Harvard, wrote, I think, a quite famous essay and then book entitled The Clash of Civilizations. He speaks of, roughly speaking, European, American, sort of South American civilization, Turkic civilization, Islamic civilization, Russian civilization, Indian civilization, Confucian civilization, Japanese civilization. We are, for the first time in history, at a period in which, by means of communication, these civilizations are being crushed together. Globalization is crushing these civilizations together. One of the responses to this that we know full well is the emergence of, to our astonishment, if you look at it from 30 years ago, the emergence of fundamentalism around the globe. You only have to look at what's happening in the Islamic world or in parts of India and Pakistan to see this. And Huntington quite clearly says in 1993 that in the post-Cold War world, the battle lines will be on the frontiers between civilizations. I think he's right, and I think we're seeing it now, and terrorism is just one piece of it. That means, I think, that we confront a global societal problem. And that global societal problem is that we have to create common spaces of a variety of kinds across these civilizations, and we're in a kind of undeclared cultural race or ideological or ideational race where values matter. We will either find common spaces politically, militarily, and I'm going to say spiritually, that can reach across the civilizations of which I spoke in ways that are sufficiently non-threatening, or the retreat into fundamentalisms is going to drive us to war. People are dying now. So this is what's lying behind the hope that I have for this book that I'm writing, bravely entitled Reinventing the Sacred. So I should tell you at the beginning that I don't believe in God. I'm, I guess, an atheist. I'm a Jewish atheist. Jews can be Jews and atheists. Catholics can't. It's one of the we can tell Jewish jokes, and we can be Jewish atheists. But I'm going to argue for the use of the God word, and I'll get there. So let me go back to Galileo, to Copernicus, to Newton, and to Laplace, to the birth of reductionism. And so this talk is partly philosophical, and this room is filled with reductionists and philosophers, so I'm in profound danger. And I expect to find out that I was right in saying so. The reductionist worldview, as Steven Weinberg famously said, and I missed meeting him last year, has at least two consequences. There are in physics only happenings. Balls roll down bowls. There's no action, there's no doing, there's no value, there's no meaning. There's just happenings. It's this reductionism that leads Weinberg to say the more we know of the universe, the more meaningless it appears. And all the explanatory arrows point downward, he says, from societies to people, from people to people parts. I'm a doctor, I know about people parts. To people parts to cells, from cells to biochemistry, from biochemistry to chemistry, from chemistry to physics, and from physics ultimately to string theory. There's 10 to the 500 string theories, so it's going to be hard to pick out which one. But leaving aside that minor problem, it's down there in string theories, or the Standard Model and general relativity and quantum gravity if we can ever invent it. The first clear statement that I know of the reductionist worldview is really Simon Laplace, in which he says, as you all know, given an intelligence of sufficient magnificence or magnitude or whatever, if that intelligence knew the position and momenta of all the Newtonian particles in the universe, that intelligence, because of the time reversibility of Newton's laws, could predict the entire future and the entire past of the universe. And this reductionism is a nothing but reductionism. That is to say, organisms are nothing but particles in motion. Agents, about which I'll talk, are nothing but particles in motion. Life is nothing but particles in motion. A couple in love on the banks of the Seine is nothing but particles in motion. And a man found guilty of murder in a New Jersey court is nothing but particles in motion. A modern view of this, and I am being followed by two superb reductionists, so I'm endangered on all sides because they're really smart. One modern view of reductionism might be the following. If you give me the wave equation in Schrodinger, the Schrodinger wave equation of the universe, and I know everything at the start, the initial and whatever the boundary conditions of the universe are, I'll just calculate forward in this thing, and I'll get out of it, if I take the Born interpretation of the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, I'll get out a probability distribution of all possible things that can happen. So let's just hold that. I'm going to argue that that view is radically inadequate. The two people who follow me may say that I'm wrong, but that's fine. That's what we're here to talk about. I think reductionism is inadequate. So the first thing I want to discuss is emergence. And I have in mind non-reductionism in a way that philosophers at least 20 years ago spoke of reductionism, in which what I will mean by a reduction is the now somewhat perhaps old-fashioned, but I think still okay, philosophic notion that a higher level theory has statements in it that are mere shorthands for some finite set of necessary and sufficient conditions stated in a lower level language. Okay? That got weakened to an infinite set, and something that I've come to understand as supervenance, and I'll criticize supervenance in a moment. Okay. So now let's be, it's important to note in passing, because I don't have much time, that there are extremely good physicists, Nobel laureate physicists, starting with Phil Anderson in 1972 in More is Different, to Robert Laughlin in his new book on a different universe, the universe from the bottom down, who seriously doubt the adequacies of reductionism. So they see emergence as real. And you can go read their books, and I can tell you about it if we have time. But just hold in mind that smart physicists in part doubt reductionisms. And others, like my sort of friendly enemy Murray Gell-Mann, is absolutely certain that reductionism is utterly right. So at least there's a debate. Now, let's move to biology. What is the function of the heart? and we call Mr. Darwin before us, and we say, Mr. Darwin, what's the function of the heart? And he says, well, you know, actually it's to pump blood, you see. And we say, well, thank you, but I mean, the heart makes heart sounds. If you don't believe me, I'm a doctor. I can do tracheostomies. I've delivered babies, and your heart goes lub-dub. And he'd say, yeah, but that's not the function of the heart. And then you'd say, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, and then he'd give a selective account. He'd say the reason that hearts have come into existence in the universe, which I'll have more to say about in a moment, is because they were of selective advantage to critters that had them, and so now there are hearts. And basically we think he's right. Already this is interesting because it says that the function of the heart is a subset of its causal consequences. It's the pumping of blood and not the making of heart sounds, okay? And that means that in order to analyze the function of a heart, you have to know the whole organism in its selective environment and probably in its selective history. Okay, the word function does not occur in physics. It makes perfectly good sense in biology. And I'm going to want to say that it's not reducible, but I'm going to have to argue for it. So first of all, let me say what I'm not saying. I will grant to any physicist in the room and any philosopher so inclined that the physicist can deduce from one of the string theories or from the standard model every possible feature of Stu Kaufman's heart, atemporally. You can just sort of say, here's the heart, here's how it works. No mystical causes, nothing fancy going on, no élan vital. That's fine. But so far, he can only deduce all the properties of the heart. He cannot pick out the function, or she, this is a non-sexist he, the function of the heart to pump blood as of special relevance. To do so, he'd have to give a selective account of why hearts exist in the universe, and we're going to ask in a moment whether or not he can do that. So I'm not saying that reductionism doesn't work in that way. What I'm going to say is that the physicists cannot give an account of the evolution of the heart. So next let's move to Darwin's idea about natural selection. So we all know it. Darwin, you will remember, had no idea how organisms had offspring with heritable variations. He thought about gemmules. And he was right. It turns out they are gemmules. They're little round things in cells, whatever. People not far from here have made self-reproducing molecular systems made out of peptides, Reza-Gadiri at Scripps, that are collectively autocatalytic, which thrills me because I happen to have a theory about that. But anyway, Reza made two peptides, and A catalyzes the formation of B out of B parts, and B catalyzes the formation of A out of A parts. So it's a little autocatalytic peptide system, which is cool because it tells you, first of all, that molecular reproduction doesn't have to be based on template replication of DNA. And second, it's collectively autocatalytic. There's no molecule in this system that makes itself. The system as a whole does. Whole long lecture here. Your cells are collectively autocatalytic. There's no molecule in them that makes themselves. Okay? Okay, now what this means already is life can run on multiple physical platforms. We use DNA, RNA, and protein, and I'm not willing, and neither is Reza, to say that what he's got is life yet, but at least molecular reproduction can run on multiple physical platforms. We have no reason to expect that life can't run on indefinitely many physical platforms, life throughout this cosmos. And we have no reason to suspect that if you change the constants of nature a teeny-weeny bit, where that's a small unit, it's sort of like epsilon for mathematicians, okay, that you wouldn't get a similar universe in which life could happen. And we can't pre-specify what that range of universes may be. Do we nevertheless understand Darwin's idea? Of course we do, okay? Malthus, food increases linearly, populations increase geometrically, you're going to get screwed, okay? So natural selection. So we believe that what I'll call Darwin's law is true in these neighboring universes and elsewhere in this universe on multiple platforms. So the philosopher will recognize this move. It's the multiple platform move. It says you cannot replace Darwin's idea by any prescribed finite list of statements about molecules. Okay? So you can't reduce Darwin's idea to physics. It doesn't beat any law of physics. It doesn't vitiate any law of physics. You just can't replace it. Here's supervenance. The move is, okay, let's let it be an infinite list. And it's a neat word. It took me years to figure out what it meant. I think it's worthless. Here's why. If I can't make the infinite list, if I can't figure out how to generate it, if there's no algorithmic way to churn out all of the possible members of the infinite list, it's just words. And so I think supervenance doesn't help at all. So I don't think we can reduce Darwin's law to physics. It doesn't vitiate physics. It just stands in its own right at its own level. Now let's come back and ask, okay, what about this heart, this Kauffman heart? Sure, you can explain all of its properties, Mr. Physicist or Miss Physicist, but can you, in fact, deduce it? Well, I'm going to show you in a minute why I think you can't deduce it. But let's say what you wanted to do is to simulate the evolution of the biosphere. I'm going to argue, and you can argue with me, and I'll tell you how in a moment, that you can't do that. So let's take this wave equation of the universe that's plopping forward. So far, it's just a bunch of possibility waves, okay? Now, in fact, organisms are classical objects. I mean, we're in one place. We're not in a superposition of places. So one way or another, you've got to get the classical world to emerge. That doesn't mean you can't calculate the probabilities of those different classical worlds, but we're going to see some serious problems with it in a moment. Let's just ask whether or not you could do it. If space-time is continuous, and it may not be, okay, it may be finite on the Planck scale, but let's let it be continuous, which is what most physicists think, you'd have to do a second-order infinity number of simulations. You can't. I think it's cheating to say that if you had an infinite number of universes and infinite resources, it would somehow be possible. I do think it makes sense to say whatever we're talking about of laws in this universe have to be descriptions that are derivable within this universe. So I don't think you can make that move. Even if you could carry out the infinite number of simulations, real quantum events, at what used to be called the collapse of the wave function in the old interpretation of Copenhagen, where something actual comes to exist in the world, has happened. Quantum events cause mutations. All the biologists in the room will say yes, okay? And that means that the way that the biosphere has evolved depends upon the specific quantum history of this universe. How would you ever confirm out of your infinite number or second-order infinite number of simulations which one corresponded to this universe? There's no way of doing it. So I want to say that the physicist cannot simulate the evolution of the biosphere. And therefore the biosphere is both epistemologically and ontologically not reducible to physics. So it's a central claim. Okay? It's not violating any laws of physics. I just say that reductionism fails. You can't carry this out. Now, in this book that I'm writing, I go through talking about how life could have started. I do have a theory about the emergence of autocatalytic sets. And besides, there's a bunch of work on the origin of life. I also talk about something else that I'm just going to say briefly. We are, in fact, agents. We're all sitting in this room talking to one another because we think that the food is great or something like that. Okay. Anyway, we're acting, roughly speaking, for our own benefit in some rough sense. And the economists assume that when they talk about utility functions. So deep in utility functions is agency. Everybody's talking about human agency. Agency is real. With agency, and if anything's agent, we are. Okay. So with agency, all sorts of things happen. For example, doing enters the universe. I am giving a talk. The way I'm wiggling my hands are rather incidental to giving a talk. In physics, nothing's incidental. It's what happens is what happens. Okay? Doing, meaning, value, purpose enter once there's agency. So in investigations, I ask myself the question, okay, what's the minimum physical system to which I might be willing to ascribe agency? And I stretched the term, thought of bacteria swimming up a glucose gradient, said, I don't think they're conscious. I don't really know. But anyway, I'm willing to say that they're agents and rocks aren't. And that's about as far as I'm willing to go. I really don't think rocks are agents. I mean, maybe you do, but you're wrong. Okay, so that's deep philosophic proof. Okay. Anyway, what I came up with is, turns out to be more and more interesting the more I think about it. I think an agent is something that can reproduce molecularly and has to do at least one thermodynamic work cycle. It's interesting that a bunch of things are interesting about this. Just briefly, cells are agents. They, in fact, reproduce and do thermodynamic work cycles. For example, mitochondria are busy doing work cycles all the time. A bacterium swimming up a glucose gradient is doing thermodynamic work cycles. It's interesting because work cycles are necessarily non-equilibrium, and they necessarily link spontaneous and non-spontaneous processes, exergonic and endergonic processes, and that all that's been happening for 3.8 billion years is that the sun's been shining, there's some geothermal chemical gradients and stuff like that, and here we are, and outside is the biosphere. Well, inside's the biosphere too. I mean, there's lots of bugs. It's bloody amazing. All this stuff has come to be, and all that's happening is the sun shining. This is the universe getting really complex right here, right now. So that's emergence. With emergence and agency, as I said, comes meaning and value. Actually, this is interesting because I think agency is a subset of life. It's a feature of life. And I realized around 3 weeks ago, this says something to Hume, who says you can't deduce ought from is. He's right, you can't. But you can't reduce agency to physics. And I think the cornerstone start of an answer to Hume, who was so wonderful, is he's right. Agency can't be reduced to is. Ought can't be reduced to is. Our values require ethical reasoning, about which we've heard a lot today, and they have their root in agency. That's where they come from. Agency. Agency is real in the universe, and that's where values come from and arguments about value. Now I want to tell you the most astonishing thing that gets back to what Deirdre says. I have to tell you what a Darwinian Pre Adaptation is. So some of you will know and some of you won't. So we said the function of the heart was to pump blood. And then we said, but your heart makes heart sounds, or at least I said. And Darwin had a really interesting idea. He said, you know what? A causal feature of an organism of no use in the current environment might turn out to be selectively advantageous in some odd environment. So your heart sound might be able to become something that detects earthquakes, for example. These are called Darwinian Pre Adaptations, and then Steve Gould, who likes new words, said, let's call them exaptations. And I don't care what you call them. That's the idea. No design. It just works out that you got a causal property that happens to be useful in some funny environment. So the canonical case, I thought, was the evolution of swim bladders into lungs. But Gunther Wagner, who knows more than I, told me, you got it backwards, Stuart. So here's what happened, say the paleontologists. Let's accept it as true. There are lungfish. The lungfish were supposedly in tepid water that didn't have much oxygen. Lungs arise as outpouchings from the gut. The fish swallowed water. The oxygen-poor water got into the lung. You got air bubbles in the lung, and so the fish survived. But now you've got an organ partially filled with air and partially filled with water. It was pre-adapted to become a swim bladder, which does the following thing. It adjusts the water-air balance in the swim bladder and adjusts neutral buoyancy in the water column. So let's accept what the paleontologists tell us is true. That's a Darwinian pre-adaptation. Everybody's got the idea now, okay? There's lots of Darwinian pre-adaptations in evolution. They're all over the place. Now I want to raise a bunch of questions about it. First of all, does it have causal consequences in the classical world, not the quantum world, of organisms? It sure does. There's new proteins, there's new species. There's all sorts of things that happen because there are swim bladders. Or if it had been the other way around, it would have been better because it would have been lungs and we'd have invaded the land. Okay? Same thing with wings and lots of other pre-adaptations. The inner ear bones of your ear derive by pre-adaptations from the teleost fish jaw bones. Do they have causal consequences? Yeah. Now I'm going to get to my trick question. There's at least two people in the audience who are going to say yes to what I'm about to say, but I'm going to ask it and see what people think. Do you think that you could say ahead of time what all possible Darwinian pre-adaptations are for all possible organisms alive today, or just for people? How many people think the answer is no? Anybody think the answer is yes? Okay, there's a couple people who think the answer. Good. You're the first two people who've said it. I already knew that David was going to say it. Terry, I hate you. I think the answer is no. Almost everybody thinks the answer is no. And I think there's a deep reason why the answer is no, and I want to focus on it. Part of the problem, at least, is we cannot pre-state what we mean by a selective environment. How would we get started on the task of listing selective environments? We can't. Now let me give you the physicist's answer. He says, look, Kauffman, okay, you're getting old, okay? Forget quantum mechanics. This is just a classical universe. Take the universe, the solar system, okay? It's just a big 6n-dimensional phase space. And the biosphere is just a subspace of that big space. So we know what all the possibilities are. So what are you yowling about? And then I say back to the physicist about the classical organs called swim bladders, that's fine, but you don't have any way whatsoever of picking out the relevant collective variables, the swim bladder, that is causally efficacious in the future evolution of the biosphere. And I don't see anything wrong with my argument at all. There's no way of picking it out. So although we might know the space of all the possibilities, it doesn't help. You can't do anything with it. Now I have to tell you one other thing that's sort of on the side. How many proteins are there length 200? Well, there's 20 amino acids. So there's 20 times 20 times 20, 200 times. So that's 20 to the 200th, which is 10 to the 260th. If you ask how many proteins could the universe make since the Big Bang 10 to the 17th seconds ago on a femtosecond time scale, if the 10 to the 80th particles in the universe, ignoring space-like separation, were doing nothing but making proteins, the answer is it would take 10 to the 67th repetitions of the history of the universe to make all proteins length 200 once. You could make it worse by making the proteins length 2,000. What about Chevrolets? What about plays? What about legal systems? That is to say, and I think this is something that becomes terribly important, at levels of complexity above the atom, the universe is grotesquely non-repeating. We can never saturate all of the complex things that come into existence. And I think it's an utter cheat to say, oh, all we have to do is wait to 10 to the 10,000th repetitions of the history of the universe. That's sort of meaningless. Okay? There's one repetition of the only universe that we actually know exists, okay? And we're not going to do it. That means that history enters. That means something ontological. That means when something complex like the heart comes into existence, it's a unique thing at this level of complexity in the unfolding of the universe. And it also means when the pre-adaptation happens that it's a unique thing that changes the unfolding of the universe. Now, with the exception of two people, I'm going to state that I don't think we have a prayer of saying ahead of time what Darwinian pre-adaptations are going to arise. Okay? We can argue later, but let me have it for the moment because I've got the podium. Then I think lots of things follow, and I'm going to just say a couple of them. One of them, and the first one is the following. Murray Gell-Mann says, a law is a compact description. I think I may be sticking in the words ahead of time, maybe not, I can't remember, of the regularities of a process. Let's take Murray's description of what a law is. If we take out ahead of time, I'll come to that in a moment. Then, although nothing uncausal happened in the evolution of the swim bladder, do we think we can have a law about the emergence of swim bladders? And I think the answer is clearly no, we can't. There's no law. It doesn't mean that laws don't apply. Nitrogen can't change to helium, okay. Physical laws still apply, but they're insufficient for what occurs in the evolution of the biosphere. This touches on Deirdre's point that inventions can't be foreseen. So let me just jump to economics for a moment, then come back. The story goes that some Texas engineers, because you can tell Texas jokes, except in Texas, okay, are trying to invent the tractor. And they know they're going to need a huge engine block. So they get this huge engine block, and they put it on a chassis, and it busts the chassis, and they get a bigger chassis, and they put it on the chassis, and it breaks it. And they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger chassis until one of them says, you know, that engine block's so big and rigid, we can hang everything off the engine block and use it as the chassis. He talked just like that. He really did. Okay. Okay. That's finding a new use for the rigidity of the engine block, right? Using it as a chassis. That's precisely a Darwinian Pre Adaptation. Could we have said it ahead of time? No. Okay? And that's the framing problem in cognitive science. In general, I think that that is precisely Deirdre's point, that it's an invention. I also think it means that the human mind is not limited to being algorithmic. I don't think there's an algorithm that can list all possible uses of a screwdriver. Okay, just to come back to that. So let's go back to this Darwinian pre-adaptation. I'm not going to take the time now. It turns out you can't even make probability statements ahead of time because you've got to know the configuration space, and you don't for the evolution of Darwinian pre-adaptations because you don't know they're going to happen. We don't have any mathematics for it. You have to know your phase space ahead of time. You have to know your state space. We can't do in Newton. We can't say what all the variables are, the laws among them, the initial and boundary conditions, and calculate forward because who knew that we were going to get swim bladders? Now I want to get from here to two major conclusions and then stop. If we don't know what's going to happen, we have to live our lives anyway. That means we live our lives forward partially or largely not knowing. That means that reason is an insufficient guide for living our lives. That means, as all of you who are studying the complex relationships between moral reasoning and emotion and reason and so on are beginning to do, we have to reintegrate our entire humanity in a way that's been lost, roughly speaking, since the metaphysical poets of the Elizabethan era who split reason off from the rest of human sensibilities. We don't know what that means yet. We're just beginning to understand it. But we do it by whatever it is that we've evolved with, intuition, emotion, culture. We have to live our lives forward even though we don't know what's going on. The next thing, and then I'm going to say two more things and sort of be done. If it is really the case that the evolution of the biosphere, the economy, technological evolution, human history, is at least partially not knowable beforehand. It's Knightian uncertainty in economics, that which we don't know even. We can't have a probability distribution over it because we don't know what it's over. Okay, so we can't have the probability distribution that you get from quantum mechanics. Neither on a frequency nor a Bayesian interpretation of probability. Because we don't know what the variables in the phase space is. You can either be appalled by that, which is the first response, was mine, or you can say, my goodness, this is incredibly liberating. In fact, what it does is it says a whole bunch of things. It says, you know what, the humanities deal with how we manage to live our lives forward, not knowing, as integrated human beings that have evolved for the past 60 million years or 500 million years with everything that we've got. Therefore, the humanities are a legitimate way of knowing how we live our lives in the world, for example, as science is, because science can't know everything. It can't know what Darwinian pre-adaptations are going to be beforehand. Too bad. That's neat. It's liberating. So what I want to say is, It's our choice whether we use the God word. Remember, I'm trying to create a space across all of our cultures, all of our civilizations. And I say that it's maybe wise to use the God word. Maybe it's not. I know it's very freighted, but it also carries with it awe and reverence. I want to use the God word on purpose as part of reinventing the sacred as the creativity in the natural universe. The natural universe. Nothing supernatural. It's reality. It's what's right around us. It's what we're doing in this conversation. Okay? That's part of the sacred. There's a lot to be said about that. But if we could share across the globe one sense of something like God, not as a supernatural God, but as something that we can rejoice in and use to orient our lives, that'd be a lot more than we have right now. And we have a race going on with the fundamentalisms that are emerging, and we better, in fact, reach out. And we got to invent a global ethic. We don't have a global ethic right now. We are reduced to consumers in modern society. Well, what happened to the other virtues that we just heard about? They've sort of gotten lost. We have to guide a global civilization of some kind that's emerging. By what moral values and what spiritual values will we do so? For the first time in history, we can construct them together. I think we ought to. So let me be an insider-outsider to this group. The response of this particular group to religious fundamentalism is to say, look, religion is really stupid. I want to say it's too strong. I want to say we've got to be careful. It can be divisive. We need to be building bridges, not defending our own tribal turf. Okay? None of us believes in God. But we still have to create a spiritual space, a value space that can stretch across the globe. And I hope we'll reach out and try to do that. Thank you.
Great, Stuart, thank you very much. While we're just changing around, we've got two more brief talks before we go out. They have to be the two people who raised their hands. So it'll be Sean Carroll and then David Albert. But in the interim, while we've got a couple of questions while Stuart's still here, Terry, you...
So this is just a fact I want to add.
This is a what?
I just want to say a fact about your heart, okay?
Oh.
You mentioned the lub-a-dub coming from your heart, right? Well, it turns out that, in fact, babies are sensitive to the lub-a-dub of their mother's heart, and it has a profound influence on the development of their brains. So, in fact, it has a causal consequence.
Yeah, no. Actually, I know that, Terry, and I accept that. But I could have picked another causal consequence of my heart that doesn't. For example, water wiggles in the space between your heart and your pericardium, and presumably that doesn't matter, right? So note all the causal consequences of an organ matter, but you're factually correct. Yes.
I had something quick. All right.
Can I tell a Jewish joke?
There's a joke I like that's marginally relevant to your point about predicting inventions. It's about this kid in college, and he takes a speed reading course, and he writes his mother that he took a speed reading course, and she writes back this long, chatty letter, in the middle of which she says, now that you've taken that speed reading course, you've probably finished this letter by now. But you don't finish the letter till you finish the letter. You don't make the discovery until you make the discovery. But
Right.
Anyway.
Right. You don't make the discovery till you make the discovery. There really are inventions.
I agree with building bridges, and I'll talk more about that. And I'd like to get into the details when I speak tomorrow about what I think that could look like for Enlightenment 2.0. I actually just came from Chicago, where I was at a very large interfaith conference for 3 days, as sort of trying to represent the humanist and atheist voice, and I'd like to encourage more of us to go and do that in the future. But I don't think we're going to make any headway whatsoever in that space if we have this sort of, this very obvious, I know a lot of people think that I'm a humanist chaplain, that's a contradiction, but I think even a more of a contradiction is to say, I don't believe in God, but let's use the word God. I mean, I think we got to do better than that. We have to do nobody's going to, I don't believe in God, but let's talk about God? I mean, it just doesn't work.
So you may be right. And I will go to the mat on some things, but not on this one. The question's a cultural, political one. The word God is obviously incredibly freighted with the notion of supernatural. On the other hand, the notion of God and sacred have evolved. For example, Yahweh was basically a mean son of a bitch, okay? And he's changed quite a bit over the last 4,900 years. The question is, and it's a deep question, do we take the most powerful symbol that we've invented and use it to bring a sense of awe, reverence, and orientation in the creative universe in which we live, in which evil happens and bad things happen, or not? Now, I don't know what's wise, okay? I know that it's freighted as heck, okay? It doesn't follow that it's not wise, but it's going to take an evolution of what we mean by the word God. So I understand exactly what you mean, okay?
Okay, I think we have to move on. But he did say, Greg, that he was a Jewish atheist, so we can say, oi, you know. So
I can say oi. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you.